we need to get to a point where real reconciliation is acceptance of all of us, and it's flying the Australian flag with all of us underneath it. And the way I was brought up in traditional terms is that when you are conceived on this country, your baby spirit leapt from the ground into your mother's belly, giving you your personal dreaming, and it didn't matter what your racial heritage was. You belonged, you have a spiritual connection to this country.
Jacinta Nampijinpa Price is a senator from the Northern Territory. She's also the coalition spokesperson at the federal level for Indigenous Affairs. Before Jacinta was elected to Parliament, as many of you may know, Jacinta worked here at CIS. She headed our Indigenous Affairs program. And among other things, she published a very important paper in early 2021 called Worlds Apart, Remote Indigenous Disadvantage in the Context of a Wider Australia. And Jacinta, as many of you know, distinguished herself during last year's Voice referendum. And in this, she joined forces with our friend and colleague who heads our Indigenous Affairs program, Warren Mundine. Please acknowledge Warren. There's Warren at the back there. Now, writing in the UK Spectator about a year ago in the lead up to the referendum, I made the point that, quote, Price had become a symbol of national protest against the shaming of people into thinking and voting a certain way. She'd brought the Voice referendum to life. She restored passion and genuine debate and meaning to politics. Voters sense her sincerity and honesty and respect it. I went on to argue, Price is moving us towards a new era in which the most significant Aboriginal force is on the right side of politics. This achievement ought to be celebrated. Instead, strenuous attempts have been made to turn Jacinta into a figure of contempt. Jacinta has endured nasty press criticism for suggesting that British colonialism had a positive impact on Aboriginal Australia. She's been called a coconut, black on the outside, white on the inside, an ignoramus, a racist, and a puppet of the think tank that I run. She's been attacked for wanting to, quote, punch down on other blacks. That was Noel Pearson. Besides the smears, she has endured intrusion into her personal life. Her private mobile phone number was recently publicised, which allowed her anonymous critics to bombard her with abusive messages. And then I concluded, and this is very relevant for a think tank like CIS, the disturbing thing about the invective is not just the vitriol, but also the unwillingness even to consider a different way of thinking about Indigenous affairs. Well, Jacinta represents a different way of thinking about Indigenous affairs, and today we'll hear this new way of thinking on a subject that's been front and centre of Indigenous affairs during the last 2 to 3 decades, native title and reforming native title. And with that, it is a great honour to welcome back to CIS Jacinta Nampijinpa Price.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks, Warren, for continuing to do the wonderful work here as Director of the Indigenous Research Program, and thanks to all of the CIS team. I feel like I'm back at a family gathering. It's really lovely to be here again at the CIS. Today, I wanted to talk about a very important issue regarding native title, especially going forward in my role as the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. But should we be successful at the next federal election, I would have the opportunity to be Minister for Indigenous Australians. And we need a whole lot of reform if we're going to see some action, some real action going forward. So, so ever since the defeat of the Voice referendum, nearly a year ago now, I've constantly been asked for my solutions to address Indigenous disadvantage. So what changes do I think we can make? I've talked a bit about auditing spending and addressing the culture of separatism and victimhood that permeates a lot of the underlying efforts to address disadvantage. But there's an elephant in the room with Indigenous policy that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, and it's one that needs it. Native title is not a popular topic in Australian politics and policy making. As with a lot of Indigenous policy, for most people, it's out of sight, out of mind. But in many ways, it's the bedrock of the Australian government's approach to Indigenous affairs and has been for several decades now. Decisions over native title like Mabo and Wick have legendary status in the story we tell ourselves as a nation. But those stories are at best incomplete. At worst, they're misleading. Because for all we can be proud of in this system, there are deep flaws that need addressing. And those flaws sit at the intersection of the same issues of separatism, victimhood, and activist meddling that I keep talking about. As a Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, I have long been of the view that the native title system in Australia needs a shake-up. Not only has it had bad outcomes, the approach also strangles the opportunities for Indigenous communities that could have taken control of their own economic destiny. We live in a country where anything is possible. Australians across generations have used the advantages granted to them by living in this country to seize control of their lives and create economic independence. And if we truly want Indigenous Australians to thrive as part of this nation, we need to make their economic empowerment possible. It starts with getting serious about dealing with the problems with native title, from which many of the problems grow. It's not pretty work. It won't get you on stage at rallies or the adulation our shallow Prime Minister so deeply craves. But doing it would actually make a difference where so much spending and rhetoric has failed. The current system sets traditional owners up to be little more than passive land holders, given an interest in land but lacking the necessary apparatus to maximise its economic potential. They are left land rich and dirt poor. I believe these are the causes. Firstly, treating land councils separately to the way we treat other corporations and failing to hold them to account for their governance. Second, the way we manage income from native title and how it's invested. Third, the massive problem of activists using land rights for their own agenda. Let me go through each of these causes. So land councils were set up to represent traditional owners and protect their interests. While state and territory legislation have some variations, it's generally the case that these councils exist for the benefit of their traditional owner membership, much like a company for the benefit of their shareholders. On paper, this sounds good. And don't get me wrong, functional land councils can be an important part of the road to Indigenous economic development. But let me tell you that I know firsthand many are not close to functional. I've heard from people on the ground that those at the top who get inside information on plans and rules around land uses manipulate the system against those they are supposed to represent. And they get away with it. Because there are simply no transparency and accountability mechanisms in place. Even strengthening the basics like reporting and record keeping could go a long way to fixing this. These are rules we place on corporations and organisations in Australia every single day. But it's illustrative of the low expectations of the separatism we place on Indigenous people that we don't demand the same from land councils. This is true also when it comes to the distribution of funds. Land councils are legally obliged to pay out to owners the royalties they get from activities like mining on their lands. But land councils are left to determine the proportions of such distribution as they see fit. I understand the desire to leave this in the hands of the council, which in theory is in the hands of the local community. But without accountability measures, we're seeing all sorts of people who are not suitable end up on land councils. The thin rules around sustainability for sitting on a land council means that, as far as I'm aware, someone who has committed an offence, like domestic or family violence, can still be on a council board. We have fit and proper person tests for boards across Australia, and yet we expect less for our Indigenous people. Not only that, the way these fund distributions are run are ripe for favouritism and nepotism. I've been there when clipboards are handed out around to members who get to write who gets what, in which circumstances. In some circumstances, someone who has been convicted of serious offences of any kind can use the system, of course, to intimidate or to bribe. We need to do away with this patronising attitude from mostly left-wing activists who don't seem to think Indigenous leaders are up to the task of meeting basic integrity and competency standards. One last related concern about land councils is the rent-seeking and standover tactics. It's rife. And again, it all comes back to the failure of successive governments to properly hold them to normal standards of transparency and accountability. I've been told of farmers performing backburning activities on their land and generously offering to do the same on neighbouring land council land. In return for that offer, the land council demanded that the farmers pay rent to access their land to do the job. Make no mistake, most of these problems come from the same underlying source: the activist insistence that Aboriginal people are different and should be treated separately. That's why I'm not surprised traditional owners are now expressing their desire to form new breakaway land councils. And until we do away with this game of low expectations, we won't be able to make sure the right people are in leadership. People who will act in the best interests of their members, not simply with respect to a dollar figure. The second problem with the native title regime is managing income and investment. My friend and yours, Warren Mundine, advocates for private property ownership on traditional land as a vital step toward greater economic participation and, in turn, closing the gap, particularly in remote communities. It's an important point because private property ownership is a fundamental element of free and democratic societies. It's kind of funny that we know from the last 200 years that socialist efforts to eradicate private property rights don't just fail, they lead to all kinds of horrors and we never hope to see again. And yet, we've been doing a version of that in Indigenous communities for decades. Why would we expect anything different? Now, part of the problem here is that native title is communally held and can't be sold or transferred. That's obviously a big risk for a bank to loan because there's no land they can guarantee to loan against in the event of default. But this is not an unsolvable problem. As Warren points out, solutions that allow private ownership on common land do exist in Australia. Arrangements like township leasing agreements or strata titles already exist. It would not be difficult to encourage understanding and accessibility of these kinds of arrangements to Indigenous people. Similarly, there is no real mechanism for using royalties from mining and native title payments for building infrastructure on these lands. Communities have no choice but to rely on government initiatives to build roads and housing. Of course, like everywhere else in Australia, the government does have a role, but there's no reason money generated from native title can't be invested back into projects that promote economic development. Another major problem is the shackles placed on Indigenous people who want to use investment strategies to build their wealth. In short, some trusts have constitutions that require them to hold a share of royalties so that money is available even after the wealth-generating activity, like mining, has finished on their land. The idea is sound, but despite a large capital base, these trusts make minimal returns and don't really end up helping people in the practical ways they need. They're simply not generating enough wealth to help people with housing or starting businesses. If, however, these trusts can be unleashed on the market, there is a huge opportunity to get much better returns that can help these communities. It will be riskier, sure, but again, we're about treating Indigenous Australians as people who are capable, not victims who need a handout. So let them take the risk. We're seeing something similar with the management of the Aboriginal Benefits Account, an account funded by the equivalent of mining royalties used for grants for Aboriginal people within the Northern Territory. Since 2012, according to the Australian Financial Review, all of the funds in the ABA have been held in bank term deposits. It doesn't have to be this way, and it led to much smaller returns than if they had been invested in the Commonwealth Future Fund. The AFR revealed they left $173 million on the table. This raises serious questions about the financial management of the account. It's why I've called for an audit, so that the bodies responsible for the investment of ABA funds are doing their job properly and delivering everything possible for Indigenous Australians. Finally, let me talk about a theme I return to a lot: the rise in activism. When you treat one group of Australians as separate and give benefits to them others don't, activists start to move in. Take the 2019 High Court decision over the Timber Creek native title dispute. It's a prime example of the creep in judicial activism. The court ordered payment of around $1.3 million in compensation to reflect spiritual or cultural loss of native title land. It was the first time that compensation for this type of loss had been found to be payable in the native title scheme. What does this even mean? Why does it apply to Indigenous people and not others? In reality, this was a case of activists using our Western judicial system and the activist sensibilities of judges to exercise the jealousy they felt over rival Indigenous groups doing well while they weren't. I know people on the ground who are connected to the case, and they tell me that because of judicial activism, that jealousy was able to be turned into legal precedent about the kind of compensation that can be paid in these cases. We also see agenda-driven activist groups, often from the cities, come in to block proposals that might be economically beneficial but are at odds with the activists' agenda. They end up finding one group of Indigenous people to pit against another, to push their agenda, and they usually get their way. The well-being and development of Aboriginal people has nothing to do with it, nor do the merits of native title. Just this month, of course, we saw Minister Plibersek block a $1 billion mining project. To do so, she overlooked the position of the Land Council with legislative authority on cultural heritage in favour of a few Indigenous people who claim cultural connection to the area in question. That meant over 800 jobs and who knows how much in royalties payments were all gone with the stroke of a pen. It wasn't just the Land Council Tanya Plibersek ignored, though. She also ignored approval given by the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission and her own departmental approval, which had considered an assessment of Indigenous cultural heritage and raised no points of concern. Either Plibersek simply took the side of the activists or caved into them. Whichever it was the activists who were in control. So much for listening to Indigenous voices. Again, to reiterate, this is the result of treating Aboriginal people as a monolith, as separate, not as people with diverse interests and motivations. Take Mount Warning in New South Wales. Here, activists have once again pitted one small group of Indigenous people over others to lock up economically beneficial land. Mount Warning used to see over 100,000 visitors every year, but it's now inaccessible to the public due to its cultural significance that is particularly only to a few Bundjalung men. Activists are exploiting the lack of certainty and contested claims to stop people from exploring some of the most beautiful parts of our country. We cannot be serious about Indigenous empowerment and closing the gap if we continue to have a system that can be manipulated like this by activists who don't actually have the interests of Aboriginal people in mind. Investment isn't possible with this level of uncertainty, and so economic growth is hampered, and it's Indigenous people who lose out the most. As I said at the start, this isn't a topic most people are interested in or want to talk about. There's a lot that's technical and difficult to understand. But I've gone through my concerns carefully today, precisely because I believe there is a much better alternative that can be achieved. It begins with not treating Aboriginal people as victims or special cases or incapable of managing their own affairs and taking risks their own way. In practice, it means well-functioning and accountable land councils who are set on maximising their land as much as they can. It means smarter and more flexible investment of the funds gained from native title projects and the freedom to use those funds to boost economic productivity and development. It means private home and business ownership and fee exchanges between communities. And it means putting a stop to self-interested activists who have shown they are not on the same side as most Indigenous communities and keep stopping projects that will help economic development for Aboriginal people. Because that's what this is about. Enough of the empty rhetoric about the voice closing the gap. Economic empowerment is the answer. That's the future we want. That's why I'm happy to speak up on tough topics and press on the sore points. It's why I talk about how bad things are, not to wallow in it like the activists do with their separatist victimhood narrative, but to look towards something better. I know it's possible, because in a country as great as Australia, anything is possible.
Jacinta, thank you very much for those sound remarks. Our first question comes from Jeremy Samet. Jeremy used to work at CIS, and these days he's the editorial and opinion page editor at the Financial Review. Jeremy.
Hey, thank you, Jacinta. Recently, the Prime Minister put the Jabiluka uranium mine into the Kakadu National Park, seemingly on the say-so of the local Indigenous people, but also after being lobbied by Peter Garrett. Last year, we also had the federal court decision in the Barossa gas project, which basically accused Environmental Defender's Office and some academics of coaching Indigenous people about cultural heritage concerns. Obviously, if native title is going to produce the economic benefits you want, resource projects are going to be a huge part of that. What's the answer to stop what seems to be the environmental movement manipulating Indigenous people to stop projects?
Thanks, Jeremy, for that question. Well, we have, as the coalition, have committed to defunding the EDO should we win government at the next federal election. I think it's our responsibility to call out their conduct at every turn. The EDO were also involved in the decision-making of Tanya Plibersek with the Regis mine. So it seems wherever they go, and even after the High Court decision, they're determined to block projects and exploit Aboriginal people, as we have seen. I think it's remarkable that the Prime Minister took Peter Garrett's advice without actually speaking to the head of the Jabiluka mining project, who I believe is an Indigenous man himself, and is hell-bent on, as he suggested at Gama, providing economic opportunity for Indigenous Australians, but tying it to what he wants in renewables. That's no way to support Indigenous Australians to become economically independent. We need a broad scope to gain that, but also we'll be continuing to call out this government, given that now Plibersek has also given the go-ahead to put 14,000 square hectares of solar panels in the territory on Aboriginal land. You can't tell me that in those 14,000 square kilometres, none of that has anything to do with any cultural significance. And yet, and the energy from that project goes to Singapore. I mean, it's just ridiculous. These are the sorts of measures that we would, I would seek to overturn some of these decisions. Certainly, we are committed to powering this country through nuclear power through the coalition, and we are rich in uranium resources in Australia, and we should not be putting a block on them, and yet allowing for lithium to be mined for EVs. It doesn't make sense. We will take a common sense approach, and it'll start with defunding the EDO and holding them to account for their continued exploitation.
Yes, and next question. Thanks, Raz.
Good morning, or actually it's afternoon, isn't it? My question is relating to Aborigines themselves, especially middle-class Aborigines who tend to believe they're victims of the system. How do you address this?
Thank you. I think my work previously here at the CIS sought to address where I guess the focus should be held in terms of, the fact that, there is a growing middle class Aboriginal Australia, and many of us are doing very well for ourselves, and we don't require any sort of support. And this is what we need to recognise, and it should be something to be celebrated at the same time. But therefore, our focus should be placed squarely where the most marginalised exist, who they are, and as the recent reporting of Closing the Gap demonstrates, that our most marginalised are those in remote communities, as I pointed out in the paper Worlds Apart, whose first language is not English. The more remote you go, the more marginalised Australians become generally, but it just so happens to be that Indigenous Australians are the most marginalised in those areas. And so if we approached supporting Australians on the basis of need instead of race, I think what we would see is that those that claim to be victims could no longer claim that, given they would sit in the group of those Australians who are not marginalised, but of course privileged. And that is what we need to do as a country. We need to focus on who and where our marginalised exist as a priority to lift them up.
Next question, Raz, thank you very much.
Hi, it's Michael French. We talk about victims a lot, but I just don't think it's just Aborigines. I think everyone's a victim today. I think when we were growing up, it was about mutual respect and resilience. Now, if you're not a victim, there's a sense of entitlement. And it's not just Aborigines. And I think our education system has a lot to blame for that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's a global phenomenon. I think that's occurring, and Western civilization, as we know it, is probably under attack. And there's currency in being able to identify as a victim these days, and we have to, as a society, move away from that thinking. And you're right, it does come down to education. Our institutions have got a lot to answer for, and I certainly think we need to do more. And again, if we can win government at the next federal election, that will be a focus for us in terms of holding our education institutions to account for the way in which they indoctrinate as opposed to educate.
And as we speak, Kamala Harris has accepted the Democratic presidential nomination. She's giving her big speech in Chicago, and one of the key themes of the Democrats in the United States over recent years, and it's happening a lot here across the Western world, and it's identity politics, the idea of dividing people up by race, religion, gender, and so on and so forth. Next question.
Yes, thanks, Jacinta, for that very illuminating address. Very, very interesting, and a lot to think about. 62% of Australians voted against the Voice, and by far the greatest majority of those will have nothing but goodwill towards our Aboriginal citizens, particularly in the remote areas. The problem is, I think, that most of those people don't understand anything about the kind of issues that you've raised, and the press doesn't raise it, certainly the left-wing press, so they're left in the dark. And I'm just wondering whether some self-help would be sort of beneficial, that those Aboriginal people that live on the remote lands, if they were to organise their own protest groups and get this kind of information on what they're unhappy about into the general media, then we'd have a much better chance of getting something done and having you elected.
Thank you. Look, and it does come back to, if you have had a good education, and if you have access to media, then certainly you have the opportunity to be heard much, more broadly. And in remote communities, unfortunately, and in traditional culture, you're not encouraged to go against the grain or stand up and speak out and those sorts of things. It takes a lot of courage for individuals in communities to stand up and speak out. I do believe, though, that particularly right now there is a bit of a shift going on, and particularly in remote communities, and conversations I've been having with traditional owners where there's a realisation that they feel like they've been taken for a ride through what I've just been talking about, through land councils and the native title processes, and they're, I'll just say, watch this space. But absolutely, it's my job, and those of us who are, elected to parliaments to represent our constituents and allow for their voices to be heard. So it's our responsibility to do so, and not just provide one narrative, which we know has occurred for so long now, which is the reason why I think I began my work, certainly here with the CIS, was to change the narrative to a more realistic one as a starting place for us to address some of our tough issues, and to ensure that the voices of the marginalised and those vulnerable people in communities are heard, which is why I also I've got a documentary on Binge called Yimijunga, which is about that. It's about the atrocities that occur in remote communities and hearing directly from Aboriginal women themselves from those communities.
You first raised these issues in a speech at CIS in 2016 about changing the narrative, and as a result, I think the National Press Club in Canberra invited you to be part of a symposium to address these issues, and on the panel was Marcia Langton, correct?
Correct.
And there was a meeting of the minds on these issues.
There was. That was 2016.
But not anymore. Okay, next question, Carolyn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Carolyn Curry, a long admirer of you. May I say I've got a cousin who's the chief vet up at Katherine, and he said the same thing's happening there as in Alice and throughout Northern Territory, that the white people who supply the support for these communities want to move because of the violence that's going on. Now, he proposed, he knows 3 prongs that are being proposed: intervention for those who are vulnerable, to better housing so that people can have their own housing, but 3, he believes the community needs protection from some of the Aboriginal people who can't seem to get off alcohol and who become violent and aggressive, etc. And we've seen terrible scenes in Alice Springs, and the same things happening in Katherine, and the same things happening throughout those communities. Whether they're being stirred up and supplied with alcohol illegally, I don't know. But you've got an election on up there for the Northern Territory. I'd like it highlighted the deficiencies in what the Labor Northern Territory candidate's proposing.
Oh, look, absolutely. Community safety is a number one issue right now in the Northern Territory, and our vulnerable there is very little community safety for our vulnerable, and sometimes in remote communities particularly they can become very unsafe places. Also, I think we need to do more to protect our children. We have the child protection system in the Northern Territory. I was told by a very senior police officer recently that the culture within the child protection system suggests that Aboriginal children should stay in dysfunction so they learn how to cope with it. That's the mentality that we're up against. So the culture of the child protection system needs to change, and Aboriginal. That's what happens when you treat Aboriginal people like another, instead of going, these are Australian children whose human rights should be upheld, and they're just not being upheld. It's an atrocity, and something that desperately needs to change, because obviously at the other end we talk about the high rates of incarceration. Well, we've got high rates of incarceration because one, those that are incarcerated mostly because of acts of violence committed against loved ones. But then those people who have committed those acts of violence have themselves likely been victims or grown up in dysfunctional circumstances. So if you protect these children, you're not going to fast track them to a life of substance abuse or incarceration or early death. And that's the key thing that we're missing. And when you have national organisations like SNAKE, who are the advocate body for Indigenous children, denying that we have the highest rates of sexual abuse in our country, denying that there's a problem, they are part of the problem.
Next question. Yeah.
Jacinta, I would just like to ask, is it mandatory for young people in the territories and the stations to be taught English? And if not, why not? I know lots don't.
So there are some schools that teach in a bilingual manner. My parents were both teachers. My mother is now working as an assistant principal for vulnerable kids in a school in Alice Springs. And it has always been our belief as a family, particularly with that background, that Aboriginal kids should be taught English. Like other children, with different languages in their background, you learn your culture and you learn your language at home. But English is the tool that you need to be successful in the modern world. And if we take that away from them, then we diminish their chances at having a fulfilled life. So you're right. English does need to be taught first and foremost in schools to give our kids that advantage. And while I think there is a place for bilingual education and children in communities to learn also their language, I think English should be the priority.
Okay, next question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Jacinta. Just want to say thanks for the talk today and coming to give that important important speech. My name is David Roy. I work for a company called CRU. We've been doing some work on minerals development policy in the Northern Territory. Something that comes up a lot is this issue of approvals for mines, and timelines seem to be a bit long. Just have a question on the sort of legislative process. So in regards to, land councils in the Northern Territory, what would sort of be the process for reform? Would it be the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and sort of how would that look in terms of actually implementing that reform?
Sure. So what I think first needs to occur is we need to review the Land Rights Act to understand where the deficiencies lie, as well as, I think, native title more broadly as well. I think a hindrance in the Land Rights Act, I believe, is the Section 19 lease applications that traditional owners seem to, if they want to go into partnership with private enterprise or create economic development with their land, that is the first hurdle, and usually the most detrimental hurdle toward getting the outcomes that they want. That process, I know some people who've put in a Section 19 lease to utilise, they're basically leasing back your own land that you're a traditional owner for, and waiting decades to get an approval or a response, or just still waiting. Also, I think we need to look at how we treat land. So the communal ownership part of the Land Rights Act can sometimes be detrimental when you don't have the opportunity for private property ownership. This is what we need to look at, whether we open up more freehold title for Aboriginal people to utilise their land, and make determinations for the parcels of land that they are responsible for themselves, without the interference of adjoining groups or interested parties that often involve activists coming in and blocking progress for traditional owners. They're the sorts of things that we need to look at reforming.
Next question from Aidan Morrison. Now, Aidan is a senior scholar here at CIS. He joined us shortly after your election to Parliament, Jacinta. And Aidan has distinguished himself this year as one of Australia's leading intellectual supporters of nuclear energy, and his team have produced several sound policy reports on the case for nuclear energy. Aidan.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you, Jacinta, for your excellent talk today. I wanted to ask your reflection on a welcome to country and speech opening that Chris Bowen gave at the National Press Club just 2 months ago. He opened his address by saying, "As we acknowledge the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, let us also acknowledge that the energy transition underway in our country can and will play a role in closing the disadvantage gap of Indigenous Australians. First Nations people have had very little equity in traditional energy generation." I just wanted, if you could reflect for a moment on whether this is the activist speaking or whether this is the genuine view of Indigenous people, because as an analyst looking at energy generation forms, we're continuously struck by how fossil fuels, and especially nuclear fuels, require a very little bit of land to generate an awful lot of value, whereas the renewable energy transition requires a huge array of solar panels and wind turbines, which impact an enormous amount of land. My intuition would have been that Indigenous people might be concerned about that huge, expansive, dispersed form of energy generation. Just thought I'd ask if you wanted to comment.
That's Chris Bowen's fantasy language. He's getting it from somewhere where the sun don't shine. I'm sorry, but seriously, all this romantic poetry that comes out of Labor is coming from somewhere, but it's ideologically driven drivel that doesn't actually, it's about pushing their ideological agenda. It's got nothing to do with, we've been so very much romanticised as a group of people. I find it just ridiculous at times being in the Senate and having to be acknowledged when, well, you don't really care for me as an Indigenous person. I'm sitting here in opposition giving you a hard time. Let's not pretend like you have any kind of respect for me. I just find it's sanctimonious, and it's nonsense. And it's tying Aboriginal people to their agenda, doing things their way and pretending as though it's come from Indigenous Australians. Indigenous Australians are far more broad-minded than that.
Next question. Yes.
Thank you. The perspective of moving towards having freehold, having private ownership of land is central to the development path that you've put forward. Of course, once you start talking about individual ownership and freehold, that inevitably means the right to sell it to non-Indigenous people. And you can see the scare campaign perhaps, or the criticism that might be valid, that we would end up in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time with large parts of what is currently traditional land owned by non-Indigenous people. I'd be fascinated by your response to that sort of issue. Thank you.
Yeah, look, again, it's infantilising Aboriginal people. You know, let that be the decision for them and their land, ultimately. I know that, you know, non-Aboriginal people are framed as evil in this country by the left, by the ideologues. But I think there's certainly ways forward, practical ways forward. That doesn't mean just handing over all the land to non-Aboriginal entities. It can be done. It can be done in a balanced way, and we've got to stop attaching stigma to it to allow these opportunities to develop, I think. And again, you know, in business, success comes from risk. And Aboriginal people have got to be allowed to fall over and get back up again and go, okay, we've learnt that one will progress forward in this particular way, instead of continually being treated like infants. So that's what I would say to that. And I know that, you know, there can be mechanisms put in place for when you think, you know, I could smell a rat here. There's an opportunist, you know, attempting to take advantage of this situation. I'm sure we can find ways around that, practical ways around that.
Next question, Salvatore Babones, Professor of Sociology at the University of Sydney and a former colleague of ours at CIS. Salvatore.
Thank you. Associate Professor Tom. I work at the University of Sydney, where I'm relentlessly bombarded with virtue signaling about our commitment to Indigenous Australia. Yet in 16 years, I've never taught a visibly Indigenous student as an undergraduate in any of my classes, including very large 1,000 student undergraduate classes. The Labour Universities Accord primarily proposes to solve this by renaming Indigenous Australians as First Nations Australians. I'm wondering if the coalition would consider a policy of providing residential bursaries for students from remote and regional Australia to steal a march on Labour in showing real commitment to Indigenous advancement.
Sounds like a great idea. Yeah, look, that's something we would absolutely consider. I think, you know, as you mentioned, these acknowledgements that take place, and sometimes I look around and I go, I think I'm the only one in the room. They're talking about me. But you're right, though. Again, I think it needs to come back to those most in need. And those most in need are certainly those in regional and remote parts of the country. You know, an opportunity to see, you know, to see people from those places achieve is what we need to encourage more so. Absolutely. Again, I think we've got to bring it back to need, because I'd like to also see non-Indigenous kids from regional and remote Australia have the opportunity, you know, to have a placement in university as well. And again, I think it should be all about need.
Next question, Kate.
Kate Mason. I'm very interested in your approach, but looking at, in retrospect, at the voice vote, Canberra, the ACT, was the only place really that had a majority yes vote, and yet these are the people that you will be dealing with all the time. How practical, what difficulties do you see in moving the Canberra bureaucracy, who we have to say are very, very largely young and highly educated, along the paths that you're suggesting?
Certainly. Look, decentralisation comes to mind. I think I've almost thought perhaps we should put the headquarters for the NIAA out in Alice Springs, and then put a few offices in some remote communities as well. It will absolutely be a challenge dealing with the bureaucracies in Canberra, and I think it is going to have to be about changing the culture of and the thinking in some of those places. That is going to be a huge part of it. I mean, I sat in I sat in a committee meeting just yesterday, in fact, and I saw a new face in the committee meeting, who was as part of the secretariat, and I realised, we now have an Indigenous liaison person sitting with us, just to, I don't know, offer advice or something. I don't know what we do, put questions to them to say, well, how do you think we should deal with Aboriginal people? This is a committee that has a bunch of us who are Indigenous already on it. So I don't know. Again, I would probably take away that position. I would probably, we've got the First Nations ambassador as well. There are positions that we just don't need. I don't know what role they're supposed to fulfill, because as far as I'm concerned, our ambassador represents the whole of Australia, including Indigenous Australia. I would stop insisting that we use terms like First Nations, because I'm not a First Nations. I'm a Warlpiri Celtic woman, and in the Northern Territory we call ourselves blackfellas anyway, right? It's just ludicrous the way in which language has evolved over time and become more sanctimonious as we've gone along. I just want to take it back to serving Australians on the basis of need and being human and being Australian fundamentally.
Talking about territories, the Northern Territory, as you mentioned earlier, is having elections tomorrow. Tell us about the CLP, this is the Country Liberal Party, and their Indigenous candidates for tomorrow's election.
So, yes, we have a number of Indigenous candidates who are running. Helen Secretary, who is running for one of our Darwin seats. We have Jared Williams, who is running for my mother's former seat of Quadja, and Ian Goombala, who is running for Arnhem, who I call, we're all related one way or another. I call him Uncle. And Yana Thompson, who's an incredible young Yolngu woman, a single mother. I met her during the lead up to the 2019 election for the first time, and I just thought she was a remarkable individual that was working as a council manager in Maningrida. But her mother said to her when she was 6, right, I'm sending you to boarding school in Adelaide. And she said she was a proper little bush kid, knew very little English and had to learn very quickly. And even though she'd come back during holidays and cry to her mum was staunch and said, no, you go back and you've got to get your education. And she's running in Arafura, and she is quite vulnerable actually, given she's a single mother, young woman, young kids, and she has been the subject of a targeted attack, to be being undermined by the daughter of the CEO of the Northern Land Council, which was reported in the paper just this week, where she was trying to elicit videos of her in her younger days when she was yahooing and that sort of thing, and was stated that, you know, my dad is looking for these videos so that we can shut her campaign down because we've heard that if the CLP get in, they're going to take away royalties. These are the sorts of lies that are spread in remote communities, and, you know, it doesn't take much for those Chinese whispers to take hold and for people to believe some of the nonsense that is spread. And her car was smashed up. She's been targeted in that way. Her car was smashed up because of these lies that have been told about her. But this is what we're up against, and this is the insidiousness of how Labor conduct themselves in remote communities to ensure their vote during elections.
Yeah, and you yourself, as I mentioned in my introduction, you've copped a lot too. Impugning your motives, name-calling, to put it mildly and politely. I think your parents' house was trashed on the night of the referendum by activists.
Egged.
But egged, that's right. They don't want to deal with the arguments.
No.
Yeah. And so her name is Yana Thompson. What are her chances like tomorrow?
I'm hopeful for her, but you know, I think that some of the damage has been done. Being also a young Aboriginal woman in remote communities, you know, in a traditional context, you're not as respected as an Aboriginal man. So that will work against her, though she has a lot of very strong family support in a lot of those communities as well. But the fact that someone who's quite powerful has been out there undermining her already, you know, she'll find it a struggle to get up.
Isn't there a broader point too, that how much progress we've made as a country? I mean, 50 years ago, there was only one Indigenous politician in Canberra, at the federal or state level, and that, of course, was the Liberal Senator Neville Bonner. These days, there are Indigenous politicians representing, I think, probably all parties, all major parties at least, Labor, the Coalition, Liberal, National, even the Greens. That's a sign of progress, surely, but we don't hear, people don't want to talk about that.
Which
so
is
much.
why we didn't need a voice.
There you go.
I know, it's like there's so much complaining about, you know, Aboriginal rights and equality and all that. Well, hello, just open your eyes. You know, it's happening, and we should be celebrating that. We should be celebrating that. You know, I mean, the fact that the Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Shadow Minister are both Aboriginal women from the Northern Territory. Hello. You know, I mean, the Northern Territory are punching above our weight. We've got 3 of our 4 federal representatives in Parliament are Aboriginal women. You know, we've kicked the blokes out.
You had a chief minister who was Indigenous too, a Liberal, right?
So the first Indigenous leader of any government in our country was Adam Giles, who was the Country Liberal Party chief minister during the Giles government, of which my mother was a minister in that cabinet also.
Okay, next question. Yeah, Peter.
The question I have is, how do we get young Indigenous students in very remote parts of the country to come to school every day, all year?
That's the $1 million question, right? I mean, and that is something that I know that my colleague and I, Karen Little, you know, are talking about. You know, what is it going to take next to ensure that we can get our kids to school? I mean, there has to be a level of responsibility from the adults in the lives of these children to ensure that those kids go to school. You know, we have to weigh up whether it is about saying to parents, well, if you're not going to send your school, you know, you're going to get a reduced amount of parenting payment. You know, do we look at that? Is that what we have to look at now moving forward to get these kids to school? I also think it's really important that the economic development piece has to happen so that parents are working. Because once parents are working, then what you'll find is kids will go to school. Health as an underlying factor needs to seriously be addressed because, you know, if you look at, I think there was a study done of incarcerated Aboriginal men, and what they found was that they had a lot of hearing problems that stem back to childhood. And a lot of kids in communities have hearing problems, which then that acts out, you know, that plays out in terms of their behaviour at school. So they're not getting an education because of health issues as well. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed in order that we can get kids to school more consistently. But also, I mean, if we look at models like the Yiperinya School model, where our most vulnerable kids in Alice Springs from town camps and a couple of the surrounding communities go to school, and the board actively participate as elders to encourage kids to be part of the kids' lives, to engage with the families, to ensure the families know that the kids should be at school. But for those kids who are particularly vulnerable, they make sure that they're there for them when their families aren't there for them. So that needs to be strengthened as well. I secured a commitment of $8 million to build a boarding facility for that school in the lead up to the last federal election, and we obviously weren't successful, but that proposal has sat in the Minister's office ever since, and they've done nothing about it. They committed $250 million to Central Australia for the crime issues, and couldn't even, now it's about $11 million that they require for the build as cost of living. But they couldn't even put that much aside in order to build this facility for our most vulnerable kids. So we're looking at that as well. Whether we invest in boarding school facilities where kids are at school in an environment that is taking care of their health needs and their their pastoral needs and for their education at the same time with adults that are there to meet their needs.
Okay, next question. Yeah.
Hi Jacinta, my name's Gemma. I'm the Vice President of the Libertarian Party here in New South Wales, and I'm not sure you know, but John Ruddick, our MLC, climbed Mount Warning in protest, and and when he went up there, he met with the communities, including Indigenous as well, and a lot of them realised this is just a government ploy, for their own benefits and whatnot. But my question to you is Lydia Thorpe. So she's obviously singing the song of treaty, which is quite dangerous, talking about the UN and things like that. I just want to know, are the Labor government, listening to her song, or is she being ignored?
I think they largely ignore her. I guess, when you're an independent, the government have the support of the Greens, so they don't need Lydia Thorpe's support most of the time.
She was a Green, but she's now an independent, correct?
She's now
and she also opposed The Voice, interestingly, didn't she?
She did.
Albeit for different reasons than you. Yeah.
So there's some things that Lydia and I agree upon. There are a lot that we don't. But certainly, we both do want an inquiry into the land councils and statutory authorities. So that is something we're on a unity ticket with going forward. So watch this space if there's not an early election called.
Another question?
Yeah, look, Michael French. As you know, I'm a big fan of mutual respect and fairness and egalitarianism. What I'm going to be interested in this answer to the question is, how do you define who is an Aborigine? So is Bruce Pascoe an Aborigine? So because what's going to happen, right, is every Australian's going to want to be an Aborigine if we're not careful.
Well, that's why we serve Australians on the basis of need and not race.
Correct.
That's the easy way.
Okay, next question. Yep.
Hi, Jacinta. Scott McClintock. Thank you for being here today and being so gracious and answering our questions. Just wanted to pick up on a point that you were talking about with the land councils and trying to get the integrity of the council members up more to the corporate sort of standard, I guess. I'm interested in, it's one thing, the fit and proper person test. How do you ensure that you get the right mix of people on the councils in terms of getting representation and ensuring that the money is getting to the right peoples in the community? Because you talked about nepotism and the like. Even I'm assuming on one hand you don't want to be too prescriptive in terms of where the money goes, but also you want to give them some sort of latitude to be able to put it to the right areas. So I'm interested in how you manage that practically.
Yeah, look, absolutely. But I think if we can get the right people, the fit and proper people in place, then we'll see that those determinations come about as a result of having the right people in place to begin with. there are some organisations that have those who have been, charged with domestic and family violence sitting on their boards. They're the kind of people that are going to intimidate their way into through decision making. So if we remove that possibility, then I think what you do have would end up with is a group of people who are there to make determinations in favour of their communities, in favour of economic development opportunities. But it also needs to be encouraged more broadly. That element was never part of it, and it is. There are those that are wanting it. I think there's so much emphasis on things like ranger programs, like it's the racial stereotype for an Aboriginal person to just want to be a ranger and have a job like that, working off the land. And don't get me wrong, absolutely there are those who want to care for the land in that capacity, but it shouldn't be the only opportunity. So what we should be placing on the table are options. And right now we don't have those options, but if they're there, then, I believe, given the right people, and they go through a process of voting their representatives, but if the representatives, if you can't apply because you've committed a violent act against someone, then that stops them in their tracks there. But if you've got good people putting their hand up for the possibility to be voted on as part of the executive, then I think that would provide that opportunity. But I want to look seriously into what it might look like for different language groups to have their own land council. So we've got two large bureaucracies in the Northern Territory, the Northern and the Central Land Council. There are those who are saying we want our own land council, much like the Tiwi have and Anundiliakwa have on Groote Island as well. And if you do that, then they know what their Jukurwa story is, how they are responsible for different parts of their land, and you don't get interference from other language groups as a result. And then there's more of a focus, and then you put those options on the table for them in terms of economic development. That's when you see things begin to change.
I've got time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Jacinta, thank you very much for speaking the voice of unity on behalf of all of us. My question is about there's a push from the left to raise the age of criminal responsibility to the age of 14. So this is something that is that the whole community is going to have to deal with at some stage. But from your experience with the Indigenous community, what do you think that could mean in terms of Aboriginal people and raising that age? Because I see it as an opportunity for exploitation of younger children rather than holding them to account, which is something that we all need to be held.
Well, this is why we've got the disaster we currently have in the Northern Territory, because the government did raise the age of criminal responsibility. And yes, we do have a situation where children are being exploited by adults to commit crimes on their behalf. And that's what it leads to. And I think in a situation where you have you've got situations where there's child-on-child abuse and sexual abuse in parts of the Northern Territory, then it should never have been allowed to occur, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think that is an answer to some of the issues that we're confronted with. And certainly the children that are stealing cars and going on joyrides in our community know that they're doing the wrong thing. They know they're committing a crime, and they know they're going to get away with it, and that's why they're doing it.
Next question.
Hi, Jacinta. Thank you for today. My name's Stephen Tripp, and I've grown up in Sydney all my life, but I don't know too many Aboriginal people. As the professor said before, there's not many around apart from maybe some small pockets in Redfern and places like that. But there's a lot of virtue signalling that happens here. I know in the University of Technology Sydney, when I was there last, they had the Aboriginal flag, the Torres Strait Islander flag, the rainbow flag and the trans flag, but they didn't have the Australian flag. And just up the road, we have the Sydney Harbour Bridge that's flying the two flags, the Australian flag and the Aboriginal flag. And I'm sure tourists come here and they see those two flags and they don't understand why there is two flags. for you as a Aboriginal lady from the Alice Springs and other Aboriginal people out in rural communities, when you see the Aboriginal flag flying on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, is that a good thing or is that just virtue signalling?
I can't speak for everyone, but I see it as virtue signalling. I think we need to create a sense of unity in our country, and right now we're divided more than ever, and that's not beneficial for any of us. I think we need to teach our children to be proud to call themselves Australian. As a nation, we are very fortunate that we don't have neighbours that are trying to invade. I mean, we could have at some point, and that's alarming because I don't think we're prepared for that. But because of that, it's allowed for this division to take hold in our country. I have a situation where I'm a mother of 4 boys, 3 of which I gave birth to, and the youngest is my baby, even though he's my stepson. He's 17, and I've been raising him since the age of 4. And he's treated differently than his big brothers, and he should never be treated differently. It's worse now than it ever has been, this sense of division, this sense that his peers look at him and just think he's a racist because he's white, without knowing that he belongs to an extended Aboriginal family, that we view one another as humans, that he knows that his skin name is Japananga, and any other boy that he meets that is a Japananga is therefore his brother. We need to get to a point where real reconciliation is acceptance of all of us, and it's flying the Australian flag with all of us underneath it. And the way I was brought up in traditional terms is that when you are conceived on this country, your baby spirit leapt from the ground into your mother's belly, giving you your personal dreaming, and it didn't matter what your racial heritage was. You belonged, you have a spiritual connection to this country. That was traditional culture. That is the culture I was brought up with. That was the culture of inclusivity that we should be preaching in this country instead of division. And that's the direction we should be going.
Well, geez, we've really got to wrap things up, but we've got one more question. Okay, you're right. Yep.
My name's Mark Hughes, and my mother started the Indigenous program.
Helen Hughes.
Here at CIS. Yeah. I co-authored quite a few research papers with CIS on various subjects. I do have one question. Before I do that, let me say that virtue signalling has its advantages. It enables you to unload your guilt without doing anything concrete. My question is actually about something somewhat technical but related to what you were talking about. Australian Securities Investment Commission regulates 1 million corporations and businesses in Australia. Then there's the Office of the Regulatory of Indigenous Corporations. They regulate 2,000 corporations, Aboriginal corporations. And basically they were set up so that those corporations don't have to meet the stringent requirements that everybody else has to. Now, you talked about the problem of regulation of statutory authorities operating in the Indigenous space. Under much of the legislation, to receive money, things like that, they have to be registered under ORIC rather than under ASIC. So I hate to add to your to-do list, but looking at how we move forward with that and how we get resolve the problem of less than optimal regulation of Aboriginal corporations might be on there.
Absolutely, and don't worry about that. They're in my sights also. I've sat through enough Senate estimates to know that they are a toothless tiger, and we really need to lift our game and ensure the same standard across the board if we expect to close the gap. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm ready. I'm ready for it.
And Mark, exactly, thank you. Thanks for the question, Mark. Great. Please welcome Peter Curdy.
Thank you, Tom. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Australia got it wrong, says Shireen Morris in her recently published book, Broken Heart. And the reason we got it wrong was because Australia turned away from constitutional change, which was the best and only way to close the gap. And the principal reason that Australia got it wrong, according to Shireen Morris, is because of the scaremongering of people like my friend and colleague, that well-known rascal Warren Mundine, and, of course, Senator Price. These scaremongers were the people who destroyed the best and only opportunity for Australians to close that gap. Well, we know that's not true, and today Senator Price has just confirmed us in our confident knowledge that that is not true. Senator Price, I can say on behalf of all my colleagues at CIS that we're really proud of you, and we follow your work with great enthusiasm, and we seek to support her in her work in every aspect of what she does in order to build on the tradition of work in Indigenous rights and well-being that we have developed here, that Tom has referred to, but also because we are committed to seeing new leaders emerge with a fresh vision and an implementable vision for life in this great country. Will you please join me in thanking Senator Price and wishing her well in her work? Thank you. Thank you, Jacinta.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.